The cry in the alley. Officer Tom Hayes adjusted his duty belt as he walked down the quiet street, the rhythmic sound of his boots echoing against the pavement. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, bathing the neighborhood in an orange glow. It had been an uneventful day, and for that, Tom was grateful. In his 10 years on the force, he had seen more than his fair share of crime, but today was peaceful. That peace was shattered by a sound so faint he almost missed it, a weak, muffled cry drifting from a nearby alley. Tom stopped in his tracks, his heartbeat quickening. He tilted his head, straining to hear over the distant hum of traffic. There it was again, a small, desperate whimper. He turned toward the alley, his hand instinctively resting on his holster as he stepped cautiously into the dimly lit space between two brick buildings. The alley smelled of damp concrete and rotting food. A row of overflowing dumpsters lined one side, their lids either missing or propped open. Tom's eyes scanned the area, searching for the source of the sound. Then, from behind a rusted green dumpster, he saw a small bundle. His pulse pounded. With careful steps, he approached, nudging aside a discarded pizza box. His breath caught as he knelt and pulled back the edges of a torn blue blanket. A baby. A tiny, shivering baby boy. Tom's throat tightened. The child's dark skin was smeared with dirt, his round cheeks wet with tears. His tiny fists waved weakly in the air, his cries barely more than gasps. The infant was so small, too small to be left alone in the cold, lying among trash like he was nothing. Tom's training kicked in. He quickly unzipped his uniform jacket and wrapped it around the baby, lifting him into his arms with the gentleness of a father cradling his newborn for the first time. The baby's body was cool to the touch, his breath shallow. "You're okay now," Tom whispered, rocking the child against his chest. "I got you, little guy." With a sense of urgency, he grabbed his radio. "This is Officer Hayes. I need medical assistance at my location. Infant found abandoned. I repeat, infant found abandoned." Static crackled, followed by a response. "Copy that, Officer Hayes. Ambulance en route." Tom didn't wait. He hurried toward his patrol car, his protective instincts in overdrive. Every second counted. He had no idea how long the baby had been out there, alone and exposed to the elements. As he settled into the driver's seat, he glanced down at the fragile bundle in his arms. The baby had quieted, his tiny fingers grasping the fabric of Tom's uniform. Tom swallowed hard, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. The hospital wasn't far, but the drive felt like an eternity. He kept glancing at the baby, silently willing him to hold on. The boy's breath was uneven, his tiny chest rising and falling erratically. "You're a fighter," Tom murmured. "Stay with me, kid." By the time he pulled up to the emergency entrance, the ambulance had just arrived. Paramedics rushed forward, their faces turning from professional calm to stunned concern when they saw the baby. Tom carefully transferred the child into the waiting arms of a nurse, but he hesitated before letting go. The warmth of the small body against him had already left an imprint on his heart. "Do we know how long he was out there?" a doctor asked, examining the child. Tom shook his head. "No idea. I found him in a dumpster. Someone just left him there." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. He had seen the worst of humanity, but something about this case twisted his stomach in a way nothing else had. The doctor nodded solemnly. "We'll run tests and make sure he's stable. We'll also need to notify Child Protective Services." Tom's hands curled into fists at his sides. He knew the procedure. The baby would be placed into the foster care system, bounced around from home to home, never really knowing stability. He turned back to look at the baby one last time before leaving, but then the child did something unexpected. He opened his eyes, deep, dark, and filled with something Tom couldn't quite place. Recognition. Tom felt an invisible thread tighten between them. The doctor's voice pulled him back to reality. "Would you like to check in on him later, Officer Hayes?" Tom hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yeah, I'd like that. As he walked back to his patrol car, a thought took root in his mind. He had found this baby abandoned, discarded like trash. But something told him this child wasn't meant to be just another case. Something told him their stories were about to become entwined in ways he never could have imagined. And he wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. A bond begins. Tom Hayes barely slept that night. He had planned to return home after his shift, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. But the image of the abandoned baby haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the infant lying in the trash, helpless and alone. So instead of going home, he found himself back at St. Mary's Hospital, standing outside the neonatal unit, watching through the glass as nurses tended to the tiny boy he had rescued. A soft knock on the door pulled his attention away. A woman in a beige sweater, her hair pulled into a tight bun, entered the waiting area. She held a clipboard and wore the unmistakable expression of someone who had done this too many times. "Officer Hayes?" she asked. Tom straightened. "Yeah." She extended her hand. "I'm Margaret Ellis, Social Services. I was assigned to the case as soon as the baby was brought in." Tom shook her hand. "Do we know anything yet? About his parents?" Margaret sighed. "Not much. No one has come forward to claim him. And there were no missing persons reports that match his description. The hospital staff didn't find any ID, no birth certificate, no note. Nothing." Tom clenched his jaw. He had hoped, deep down, that this was some tragic accident, that maybe a desperate mother had left the baby behind out of fear but had planned to come back. But now it seemed more likely that someone had abandoned the child intentionally. "What happens to him now?" Tom asked, though he already knew the answer. Margaret gave a sympathetic smile. "He'll be placed into the foster system once he's healthy enough to be discharged. If no family steps forward, we'll begin the process of finding a home for him." Tom's stomach twisted. Foster care. He had heard the stories. Children shuffled from one house to the next, some lucky enough to find loving homes, others not so much. He thought about the baby, so small and fragile, already abandoned once. Would he be abandoned again? Margaret continued, unaware of the war raging inside Tom's mind. "The first step will be finding a temporary placement. If you know of anyone who might be willing to take him in, even just for a short while, that would help." Tom's mouth opened before his brain could stop him. "What about me?" Margaret blinked. "You?" Tom swallowed hard. He hadn't meant to say it. He hadn't planned this. He was a police officer, single, with long shifts, and a demanding job. He wasn't exactly parent material. But then he looked through the glass again, saw the baby curled up in the hospital crib, and something in his chest tightened. He thought of his own childhood, how he had been given a second chance, how two loving people had taken him in and given him the life he never would have had otherwise. Maybe it was his turn to do the same. "I know fostering isn't easy," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But I don't like the idea of him getting lost in the system. I don't want him to end up just another case file." Margaret studied him for a long moment. "It's a big responsibility, Officer Hayes. You'll need to go through an evaluation, background checks, home visits." "I'll do whatever it takes," Tom said firmly. Margaret smiled, just a little. "All right," she said. "I'll start the paperwork. A home for Ethan." The next few days were a whirlwind of forms, interviews, and home inspections. Tom had never imagined himself as a father, let alone a foster parent. He had no crib, no diapers, no idea how to take care of an infant. But when the hospital called to say the baby was ready for discharge, Tom didn't hesitate. He drove straight there, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his heart pounding. Margaret met him at the hospital entrance, carrying a small car seat. Inside, wrapped in a blue blanket, was the baby boy. "Here's your temporary house guest," she said, setting the car seat down gently. Tom knelt in front of the baby, looking at him properly for the first time. The little boy blinked up at him with wide, curious eyes. His tiny hands curled into fists, and Tom noticed the faintest hint of a crescent-shaped birthmark on his left shoulder. Tom reached out, letting the baby wrap his fingers around one of his own. "Hey there, little guy," he murmured. The baby made a soft noise, almost like a sigh, and Tom's chest clenched. "Have you thought of a name?" Margaret asked. Tom nodded. "Ethan." Margaret smiled. "Ethan it is, then." The drive home felt surreal. Every time Tom hit a stoplight, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting Ethan to disappear, as if this was all some bizarre dream. When he pulled into his driveway, reality hit him like a brick. His house wasn't baby-proofed. He had no clue how to change a diaper. And he was suddenly responsible for a tiny human being. He carried Ethan inside, setting the car seat gently on the kitchen table. The baby kicked his legs, staring up at the ceiling as if completely unaware that his entire world had changed. Tom ran a hand through his hair. "All right, buddy," he said. "I guess we're in this together." Sleepless nights and first smiles. The first night was chaos. Tom had expected some crying, but nothing prepared him for the full-force wails that echoed through his apartment at 2 in the morning. He tried everything. Rocking, walking, humming off-key lullabies. Nothing worked. By 3 a.m., both of them were exhausted. Tom finally sat down in the rocking chair he had borrowed from a neighbor, holding Ethan against his chest. "I have no idea what I'm doing," he admitted to the baby. Ethan hiccuped, then nestled closer. Tom exhaled, rubbing his back in slow circles. "But I'm gonna figure it out." The days turned into weeks. Slowly, Tom adjusted. He learned how to make bottles, how to function on 2 hours of sleep, how to decipher the different cries. Ethan, for his part, began to change too. He grew stronger, his once frail frame filling out. His cries became less frequent, replaced by bright-eyed curiosity. One evening, as Tom played peekaboo with him on the couch, Ethan let out a tiny, bubbling laugh. Tom froze. Ethan giggled again, his dark eyes lighting up. Tom's heart clenched so hard it hurt. "You think I'm funny, huh?" he said, grinning despite himself. Ethan cooed in response, kicking his legs excitedly. Tom felt something settle deep in his chest. He had told himself this was temporary, that he was just helping until a more permanent home could be found. But as Ethan wrapped his tiny fingers around Tom's thumb, he knew. He wasn't just fostering this child. He was becoming his father, and nothing in the world could make him give that up. The truth beneath the surface. The days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months. Tom had long stopped thinking of himself as just a foster parent. Ethan had woven himself into every corner of his life. His cries in the middle of the night, his bright-eyed giggles in the early mornings, the quiet weight of him sleeping against Tom's chest after a long day. This was his son. And yet, the lingering question of Ethan's origins haunted Tom like a shadow he couldn't shake. No one had come forward to claim the baby. No missing persons reports matched Ethan's description. No DNA matches were found in the system. It didn't add up. A baby doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Someone had left Ethan in that alley. Someone who had wanted him to disappear. Tom's instincts as a cop told him that there was something more to this story. And as much as he wanted to believe Ethan was simply an abandoned child, deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. Something wasn't right. The first clue. It started with the birthmark. One evening, after giving Ethan a bath, Tom wrapped him in a fluffy towel and carried him to the changing table. As he dried him off, his eyes fell on the faint crescent-shaped birthmark on the baby's left shoulder. He had noticed it before, but tonight, something about it made him pause. Tom had seen a lot in his career: gang tattoos, prison ink, strange identifying marks on suspects. But this was different. The mark was oddly symmetrical, almost deliberate, as if it had been placed there on purpose. A thought struck him. Tom grabbed his phone and quickly searched online for crescent-shaped birthmark meaning. Most of the results were generic: Stories about birthmarks in folklore, medical explanations for pigmentation variations. But then, buried deep in the search results, something caught his eye. An old article. It was a missing child case from nearly a decade ago. Tom's breath caught as he clicked on it. The article told the story of a wealthy and influential family whose newborn son had been kidnapped from the hospital the night after he was born. The case had never been solved. And in the grainy, black and white photo included in the article, the baby in the picture had the same distinct crescent-shaped birthmark on his left shoulder. Tom's pulse thundered in his ears. Could it be? Digging deeper, Tom knew better than to jump to conclusions. Coincidences happened. There were plenty of babies with similar birthmarks, but something about this felt different. He reached out to his partner, Officer Mike Johnson, a veteran cop with a reputation for having good instincts. "You ever see anything like this?" Tom asked, showing Mike the article and a picture of Ethan's birthmark. Mike studied it, his brow furrowing. "Looks like more than just a coincidence. You said no one ever claimed him." Tom shook his head. "Not a single report. But if this article is right, and this baby really was taken from the hospital all those years ago, that means someone took him, kept him hidden, and then, for some reason, decided to dump him in that alley." Mike let out a low whistle. "That's heavy, man." Tom ran a hand through his hair. "I need to be sure. I need to know if Ethan is that missing child." Mike hesitated. "You know, if you dig too deep into this, there's a chance you might lose him, right?" The words hit Tom like a punch to the gut. He had spent months raising Ethan, feeding him, rocking him to sleep. He had built a life around this child. But he also couldn't ignore the truth. Ethan had a past, a family out there somewhere. And no matter how much Tom loved him, he couldn't keep that from him. "Yeah," Tom said quietly. "I know. A DNA test and a hard truth." Tom pulled every string. He had to get the DNA test done quickly. He told himself he wasn't hoping for one answer over the other. But that was a lie. If the test came back negative, it meant Ethan had no known family. It meant he could stay with Tom. It meant things didn't have to change. But if the test came back positive, then Ethan belonged to someone else. The waiting was the worst part. Every day, Tom went through the motions, pretending everything was normal. He took Ethan to daycare before his shift, made him laugh during bath time, held him close before bedtime. But at night, when the house was quiet, the weight of the unknown pressed down on him. And then, one evening, his phone rang. He hesitated before answering. "Officer Hayes." It was a woman's voice. "Dr. Peddle from the State Forensic Lab." Tom swallowed hard. "Yeah, I'm here." There was a brief pause. "We got the results back. The DNA sample you submitted matches a case in our database. Ethan is a biological match to a missing child report from 7 years ago." Tom's stomach dropped. "His real name is Elijah Calloway," Dr. Peddle continued. "He was reported kidnapped as a newborn from Mercy Hospital 7 years ago. His parents, they've been looking for him ever since." Tom barely heard the rest of what she said. Ethan wasn't just a lost child. He had a family that had never stopped searching for him, a family that had just been given the answer they had been waiting for. A father's dilemma. Tom ended the call and sat in stunned silence. Elijah Calloway. Not Ethan Hayes. Not his son. A deep ache settled in his chest. He had known this was a possibility, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of it. Somewhere out there, Ethan's, Elijah's, real parents were about to find out their baby boy was alive. And Tom was about to lose the child who had become his entire world. He stood up, moving on autopilot, and walked to Ethan's room. The little boy was curled up in bed, his chest rising and falling in steady breaths. His tiny fingers gripped the edge of his favorite blanket, the one Tom had bought him the first night he brought him home. Tom knelt beside him, his throat tightening. How could he let him go? How could he be the one to tell him that everything he knew about his life was about to change? But deep down, Tom already knew what he had to do. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it would break him, he had to tell the truth. Because that's what a father does. A father's crossroads. Tom stood outside Ethan's bedroom door, his breath shallow, his fists clenched. He had faced criminals, violent standoffs, and the darkest corners of humanity in his years as a cop. But nothing had ever prepared him for this. Telling Ethan that his life, his very name, wasn't really his. That the father he had known, the home he had built, was all temporary. How was he supposed to do this? Tom turned the doorknob with careful hands, pushing open the door to reveal the quiet, moonlit room. Ethan was fast asleep, curled up with his stuffed dog, his tiny body rising and falling in peaceful breaths. Tom swallowed the lump in his throat and sat down on the edge of the bed. His son. No, Elijah Calloway. The name felt foreign, wrong. Tom had called him Ethan since the day he first held him. He had whispered it to him in the dead of night, comforted him with it when he cried. To him, Ethan wasn't just a name. It was the identity of the boy he had raised. And yet that name, Ethan, was not his to give. Tom rubbed his hands down his face, exhaling heavily. "What am I supposed to do, buddy?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. And then, as if sensing his distress, Ethan stirred. His little eyes fluttered open, groggy but searching. "Daddy?" His voice was thick with sleep, but there was concern in his tone. Tom's heart cracked right down the middle. He wasn't ready. He wasn't strong enough for this, but Ethan deserved the truth. "Hey, bud," Tom said softly, forcing a smile. "Sorry to wake you. Go back to sleep." Ethan blinked up at him, his brows crunching. "You look sad." Tom let out a shaky breath and ruffled the boy's soft curls. "I just got a lot on my mind, that's all." Ethan, ever perceptive, tilted his head. "Is it 'cause of me?" And just like that, Tom felt the full weight of his emotions slam into him. Because yes, it was because of Ethan. Because he loved him too much. Because he couldn't imagine a life without him. Because he was about to break his own heart. And Ethan's, by telling him the truth. But tonight wasn't the night. Not yet. Tom leaned down and kissed Ethan's forehead, lingering for just a second too long. "Go back to sleep, buddy," he whispered. Ethan nodded, his eyes drooping closed once more. Within seconds, he was out again, lost in dreams. Tom sat there for a long time, watching him. Because soon, too soon, everything would change. And he didn't know if he was strong enough to let go. The call that changed everything. The next morning, Tom stood outside the precinct, gripping his phone in trembling hands. He had stared at the number for nearly 20 minutes, willing himself to dial. The Calloways, Ethan's real family. He had done his research. The Calloways were wealthy, their influence stretching far beyond the city. Andrew Calloway was a high-powered attorney, and his wife, Danielle, had been a rising journalist before their son's disappearance. They had never stopped searching. Tom had seen the interviews, the ones from years ago when the pain was fresh, their voices shaking as they pleaded for their son's return. He had seen the more recent articles, where their hope had dimmed but never truly disappeared. And now, after 7 years of searching, they were about to get the call that would change everything. Tom closed his eyes and pressed dial. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, a voice. "This is Andrew Calloway." Tom's breath caught. "Mr. Calloway, my name is Officer Tom Hayes," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "I think I found your son." There was silence. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "What did you just say?" Andrew's voice was low, almost dangerous, like he was afraid to believe it. Tom swallowed. "I've been fostering a boy for the past few months. He matches the description of your missing child. We ran a DNA test. It's a match." A sound that was half sob, half disbelieving laugh crackled through the receiver. "My son, Andrew whispered, his voice breaking. Elijah. Tom closed his eyes. Yes. A rustling sound came through the line, and suddenly, a new voice, softer but frantic. This is Danielle Calloway. The woman said, her breath coming in gasps. Please tell me where he is. Is he safe? Is he okay? He's safe, Tom assured them quickly. He's happy. He's been living with me. Danielle let out a full-bodied sob, the kind of relief that only comes after years of agony. Oh my God, she choked out. Oh my God, Andrew, he's alive. Tom's grip on the phone tightened. I understand this is a lot to process, he said carefully. I want to do this the right way. I want what's best for Ethan, for Elijah. There was a brief silence. And then Andrew spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. When can we see him? The meeting. Tom arranged for the Calloways to meet Ethan at a neutral location, a park, somewhere open and quiet, away from the prying eyes of reporters. The day of the meeting, Tom felt like he was walking through water, every step heavy. Ethan was excited. Tom hadn't told him everything, just that there were some nice people who wanted to meet him. He didn't yet understand the full gravity of what was about to happen. As they arrived at the park, Tom spotted them instantly. Andrew and Danielle stood by the benches, gripping each other's hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Danielle's face was streaked with tears, her breath coming in short gasps. Andrew, though more composed, was visibly trembling. And then Ethan saw them. Tom crouched beside him, gripping his small shoulders. You see those people over there, buddy? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. Yeah. They're special, Tom said, forcing a smile. They'd been waiting a really long time to meet you. Ethan tilted his head. Why? Tom swallowed past the lump in his throat. Because they love you. And then, before he could second-guess himself, he let go of Ethan's shoulders. Ethan hesitated for only a moment. Then, curiosity won out. He walked toward the couple, his small feet crunching against the gravel. Danielle let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with both hands. Ethan stopped in front of them, looking up. Hi, he said simply. Danielle's breath hitched. Andrew knelt, his voice thick with emotion. Hi, Elijah, he whispered. Ethan blinked. My name's Ethan. Danielle let out another choked sob, nodding through her tears. Okay, she whispered. Ethan. Hi, sweetheart. And then, unable to stop herself, she reached out, hesitant, as if afraid he would disappear, and cupped his tiny face in her hands. Ethan didn't pull away. Tom's chest ached as he watched, because he knew. This was the moment he had lost his son, a family divided. Tom watched from a distance as Ethan stood in front of Andrew and Danielle Calloway. He had expected Ethan to hesitate, to cling to his leg the way he always did when meeting strangers. But instead, Ethan stared up at Danielle, his tiny face full of curiosity. Danielle, overwhelmed with emotion, let out a shaky breath and whispered, Can I hug you? Ethan hesitated for a moment, looking back at Tom, as if seeking permission. Tom forced himself to nod. Ethan turned back to Danielle, then gave a small shrug. Okay. Danielle let out a sob and immediately wrapped her arms around him, clutching him as if she were afraid he'd vanish again. Ethan stiffened at first, but then, slowly, his little hands came up, pressing against her back. Tom clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay strong. This was what was right. This was what was fair. So why did it feel like someone was ripping his heart out? The parents' plea. After a few minutes, Andrew cleared his throat, breaking the moment. Ethan, can we sit and talk for a little while? Ethan looked up at Tom again. Tom smiled, though it felt like a lie. Go ahead, buddy. I'll be right here. Ethan nodded and let Andrew take his small hand, leading him toward a nearby bench. Danielle wiped her tears and sat beside them, her hand never leaving Ethan's back, as if she were afraid he'd disappear if she let go. Tom stayed where he was, hands in his pockets, forcing himself to breathe. Andrew glanced at him. "Officer Hayes, would you join us?" Tom hesitated before nodding. He moved toward the bench, but he didn't sit. He needed the distance. Danielle cleared her throat. "Ethan, there's something we need to tell you." Ethan looked at her expectantly, swinging his legs. "Okay." Danielle took a deep breath. "A long time ago, when you were just a tiny baby, you were taken from us." Her voice wavered. We lost you, and we've been looking for you ever since." Ethan frowned. "Lost me?" Andrew cleared his throat. "You see, buddy, you were born into our family. Your name was Elijah. But someone took you away before we could bring you home. And we didn't know where you were for a very long time." Ethan's little eyebrows scrunched up in confusion. He looked between them and Tom. Tom held his breath. Ethan shook his head. "But my name is Ethan." Danielle wiped a tear away, smiling softly. "I know, sweetheart. And that's okay. But before you were Ethan, you were Elijah. That's the name we gave you when you were born." Ethan looked back at Tom, his eyes full of questions. "Daddy?" Tom felt like his lungs had collapsed. But he couldn't break now. He forced himself to kneel in front of Ethan, making sure his voice was steady. "They're telling the truth, buddy," he said gently. "A long time ago, you had a different life. And these people, they're your family." Ethan's little mouth pressed into a frown. He looked back at Andrew and Danielle. "You're my family," he repeated, uncertainty creeping into his voice. Danielle let out a soft sob, reaching for his small hand. "Yes, baby. We are." Ethan pulled his hand away. "But Daddy is my family too." Tom's heart cracked wide open. Andrew exhaled deeply, exchanging a look with his wife before turning back to Ethan. "Yes, he is, and we are so grateful to him for taking care of you. But we want to get to know you too. We want to be in your life again." Ethan bit his lip. "Does that mean I have to leave, Daddy?" Silence fell over the group. Tom's body stiffened. Danielle's face fell, and she looked to Andrew, her expression pleading. Andrew hesitated. We don't want to take you away from anyone you love," he said carefully. "We just want a chance to be part of your life too." Ethan thought about this for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay." Danielle let out another sob, pressing a hand to her mouth. Tom forced himself to breathe. He had expected resistance. He had expected confusion, even fear. He had not expected Ethan to accept it so quickly. And that hurt more than anything. A decision looms. The meeting ended on a promise. Ethan would see them again. Tom drove home in silence, his grip tight on the wheel, his heart a storm of emotions. Ethan, blissfully unaware of the depth of what had just happened, kicked his legs in the backseat, humming to himself. It was just another day to him. But for Tom, everything had changed. By the time they got home, Ethan was sleepy. Tom carried him inside, tucked him into bed, and sat beside him, just watching. For months, it had been just the two of them. And now, Tom didn't know how much time he had left. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked the screen. A message from Margaret Ellis, the social worker handling Ethan's case. "We need to discuss the Callaway's next steps. Let's set up a meeting this week." Tom clenched his jaw, staring at the words. The next steps. He knew what that meant. Custody. They would fight for him. And legally, they had every right to. Tom swallowed hard, looking down at the sleeping child beside him. Ethan didn't belong to him. Not legally, not biologically. But in every way that mattered, he was Tom's son. And Tom wasn't sure if he was strong enough to let him go. The custody battle that changed everything. The meeting with the social worker had been inevitable. Tom sat across from Margaret Ellis in the CPS office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His heart was a pounding drum, his body coiled with tension as she laid out the reality of the situation. "The Callaways are filing for full custody," Margaret said, her voice careful, as if trying to break the news gently. Tom had expected this, but hearing the words out loud still sent a dagger through his chest. Margaret continued, "Legally, they have a strong case. They're his biological parents, and there's ample proof that Elijah, Ethan, was kidnapped as a baby. The courts tend to favor biological family reunification when possible." Tom's jaw tightened. "And what about what Ethan wants?" Margaret sighed. "That will be considered. But he's still young. The courts will assume he can adapt." Tom clenched his fists. "He's not just some pawn to be moved around." Margaret gave him a look of sympathy. "I know. And I believe the Callaways don't see it that way either. They've already agreed to take things slow, to not rush the transition." "Transition," Tom muttered bitterly. The word felt sterile, clinical. It didn't capture the real truth that he was about to lose his son. Margaret hesitated. "Tom, I know this is hard, but I need to ask, are you going to fight the custody case?" Tom opened his mouth to say yes, to say he would fight with everything he had. But then he thought about Ethan, the little boy who had already been abandoned once, the child who had been torn from his first family, placed into a new life, and was now at risk of being uprooted again. Could he really put Ethan through a court battle? Could he really drag him through a fight that would only confuse him further? His gut twisted, and for the first time, Tom didn't have an answer. Torn between two fathers. The following week, Tom met Andrew Calloway for coffee. It was an unspoken agreement between them. Danielle was too emotional, too raw to have this conversation. But as the two fathers sat across from each other in the quiet cafe, the weight of the situation pressed down on both of them. Andrew was the first to speak. "I want to start by saying, I respect you, Officer Hayes." He exhaled, as if gathering himself. "You saved my son. You raised him. And for that, I will always be grateful." Tom's fingers curled around his coffee cup. "But," Andrew met his gaze, "but he's my son." Tom inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. Andrew continued, his voice even but firm. "We lost him once. I can't lose him again." Tom swallowed hard. "And what if I say I can't give him up?" Andrew's jaw tightened. "Then we fight it in court. And trust me, Officer Hayes, my wife, and I have the resources to win." There it was, the unspoken threat. Tom gritted his teeth. "You think money wins everything?" Andrew shook his head. "No, but the law is on our side." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I don't want this to get ugly. We want to do this the right way. We want Ethan to transition into our home slowly. We're not asking you to disappear from his life. We just want our son back." Tom looked away, his heart aching. Because, God help him, he understood. If someone had taken Ethan from him, he would have burned the world down to get him back. But Ethan wasn't a possession. He wasn't something to be won or lost in a legal battle. He was a little boy who just wanted to feel safe. Tom exhaled. "He calls me Dad." Andrew flinched. "I know." Tom's voice dropped, barely above a whisper. "I love him." Andrew's eyes shone with emotion. "So do we." They sat there in silence, two fathers who both loved the same child, both unwilling to let go. But only one of them could have him. And Tom was starting to realize it wasn't going to be him. Ethan's confusion. Tom had always prided himself on being able to read people. But Ethan was still a mystery. The little boy hadn't said much since the meeting with the Callaways. He was quieter, more reserved. He played with his toys, but didn't laugh as much. He clung to Tom a little tighter at bedtime. And then, one night, just as Tom was tucking him in, Ethan finally spoke. "Daddy." Tom swallowed. "Yeah, buddy." Ethan hesitated, gripping his stuffed dog. "Do I have to leave?" Tom's heart cracked. No one's making you do anything you don't want to do, Tom promised, though he wasn't sure if that was even true. Ethan looked up at him. But they're my real mom and dad. Tom felt like he was walking through fire. They're the mom and dad who brought you into the world. Yeah. Ethan frowned. But you're my real dad too. Tom's breath caught. Ethan wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. Tom forced a smile. Yeah, buddy. I am. Ethan hesitated again, then whispered, I don't want to go. And that was the moment that broke Tom. Because he had been holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, Ethan would be excited to have his biological family. That maybe this transition wouldn't be as painful as he had feared. But now he knew. Ethan didn't care about bloodlines. He just wanted to stay where he felt safe, where he felt loved, where he had always belonged. And Tom knew, in that moment, what he had to do. The hardest choice. Tom had never felt more exhausted than when he sat down in front of Margaret Ellis the next morning. I'm not going to fight it, he said, his voice hoarse. Margaret blinked. You're what? Tom exhaled. The Callaways. They deserve to know their son. I can't take that away from them. He rubbed his face. But I don't want Ethan to feel like I abandoned him. I need to be part of this transition. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I think that's the best thing for everyone. Tom let out a bitter laugh. Best for everyone. Except me. Margaret gave him a look of sympathy. You're making the sacrifice, Tom. And that's what good parents do. Tom closed his eyes. Yeah, that's what parents do. The goodbye that wasn't goodbye. A month later, the final custody agreement was signed. Ethan would move in with the Callaways, but Tom would remain a part of his life. Weekend visits, holidays, and a promise that no matter what, Ethan would always have a home with him. The night before the move, Tom sat with Ethan in his room, helping him pack his favorite toys. Ethan was quiet, unusually so. Finally, as Tom zipped up the bag, Ethan whispered, Are you still my dad? Tom's throat tightened. He pulled Ethan onto his lap, holding him close. I will always be your dad, Tom whispered fiercely. No matter where you go, no matter what happens, you will always have me. Ethan clung to him, his little fingers curling into Tom's shirt. I love you, Daddy. Tom closed his eyes, swallowing past the pain. I love you too, buddy. And as Ethan fell asleep in his arms one last time, Tom silently promised himself, this wasn't goodbye. This was just the start of something new. Love beyond blood. The day Ethan left was the hardest day of Tom's life. He had prepared himself. He had told himself over and over that he was doing the right thing, that Ethan deserved to know his biological family, that he was making the ultimate sacrifice for the little boy he loved. But nothing could prepare him for the sight of Ethan standing at the doorway, his tiny suitcase in hand, looking up at him with wide, scared eyes. Danielle and Andrew stood behind him, their expressions filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. They had been patient, understanding. They had given Tom extra time with Ethan before the transition, understanding that separating them would never be easy. And now it was happening. Ethan clutched his stuffed dog in one hand, his fingers gripping it tightly. Do I have to go? Tom swallowed the lump in his throat and knelt in front of him. Buddy, this isn't goodbye, okay? You're just going to live in a new house, but I'll still see you all the time. Weekends, holidays, whenever you need me, I'll be there. Ethan's bottom lip trembled. Promise. Tom cupped his small face gently. I promise. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before throwing his arms around Tom's neck, hugging him so tightly it nearly knocked the air out of him. Tom held him close, his heart breaking into pieces. Then, with slow, hesitant steps, Ethan turned and walked toward Andrew's waiting arms. Tom watched as the boy who had become his son got into the Callaways' car. And just like that, he was gone. The aftermath. The house was too quiet, too still, Too empty. Tom sat in Ethan's room that night, staring at the untouched toys and the small bed that still carried the scent of baby shampoo. For months, his life had been filled with the chaos of fatherhood. Late-night feedings, diaper disasters, giggling fits over cartoons, and the sweet weight of a sleepy child in his arms. Now, there was nothing but silence. For the first time in his life, Tom felt truly, completely alone. He went back to work, burying himself in cases, throwing himself into long shifts. His colleagues noticed the change, the way he moved through the motions like a man haunted. Mike, his partner, finally cornered him after a late-night patrol. "Man, you look like hell. You gotta talk to someone." Tom let out a humorless chuckle. "Talk about what?" Mike crossed his arms. "About the fact that you lost your kid, and you're acting like you're fine when you're not." Tom clenched his jaw. "He's not my kid." Mike scoffed. "Like hell he's not." Tom exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how to do this. He's with them now. He's happy, I guess." His voice cracked. "I should be happy for him." Mike sighed. "Tom, being a dad isn't about blood. It's about showing up. And you're still his dad. That doesn't change just because he's living somewhere else." Tom rubbed his face, exhausted. "Doesn't feel like it." Mike clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Then make sure it does." Adjusting to a new life. For Ethan, the transition wasn't easy. His new home was big, much bigger than Tom's apartment. His bedroom had high ceilings and a window overlooking the huge backyard. He had everything he could ever want. New clothes, new toys, a brand new life. But at night, he still clutched his stuffed dog, missing the creaky rocking chair in Tom's house. Danielle and Andrew tried everything to make him comfortable. They showered him with love, introduced him to new experiences, and reassured him every step of the way. But Ethan still had questions. One night, as Danielle tucked him into bed, he whispered, "Does Daddy still love me?" Danielle's heart clenched. She brushed his curls back gently. "Oh, sweetheart. Of course, he does. He loves you so much." Ethan looked up at her. "Then why doesn't he come get me?" Danielle swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Because he loves you enough to do what's best for you." Ethan frowned. "But I want both." Danielle's eyes filled with tears. "I know, baby. And you will always have both." The first visit. Tom had expected it to feel awkward. When he pulled up to the Callaways' house that Saturday morning, he wasn't sure what to expect. Would Ethan still want to see him? Would he be different? Would he still be Tom's little boy? But the second the front door opened and Ethan saw him, all of Tom's fears vanished. "Daddy." The little boy launched himself forward, nearly knocking Tom off balance as he wrapped his arms around his legs. Tom let out a shaky breath and lifted him up, holding him tight. "Hey, buddy." Ethan pulled back, grinning. "Wanna see my new room?" Tom forced himself to smile. "Yeah, I'd love that." Danielle and Andrew stood in the doorway, watching the reunion with quiet understanding. They weren't trying to replace Tom. They just wanted to share Ethan with him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A new kind of family. Over the next few months, they found their rhythm. Ethan spent weekends with Tom, where things felt normal again. Saturday morning cartoons, pancakes, and bedtime stories. But then he'd return to the Callaways, growing more comfortable in his new home. At first, it was hard. But slowly, Tom realized something. Ethan was happy. Not just with the Callaways. Not just with Tom. With both. And that was all that mattered. Years later, time passed faster than Tom expected. One day, he blinked, and suddenly Ethan was 9 years old, standing on a stage at his school talent show, nervously clutching a microphone. Danielle, Andrew, and Tom sat together in the audience, waiting. Then Ethan took a deep breath and began to sing. It was a song Maria had taught him, a soft, beautiful melody that filled the auditorium. Tom's breath caught. Because in that moment, watching Ethan stand tall, watching the confidence in his eyes, he knew Ethan wasn't just part of one family. He was part of both. And Tom, he would always be his father, no matter what.